Okay, so this is the Cluster API Provider vSphere meeting of the 15th of October. Please note that we're running under the CNCF code of conduct. So be excellent to each other. Please use the raise hand feature if you want to make a point. Yeah, we'll get started. So I'm covering for Yassine today. I have not been massively involved with Cluster API vSphere for recently, so I'm just going to be mostly facilitating. So there's nothing I don't think we have anything in terms of news and updates. So I guess we'll go straight to the first discussion topic, which is Jun. Do you want to take that away with the CAPV failure domain discussion?
Yeah, sure. Shall I share the screen, or guys, you can go to.
Yeah, give it a go. I'm not sure if I've got the permissions. Let's see if I can do that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm able to share. Cool. Yeah, so this is the continued discussion on the control plane failure domain proposal that we had from the last meeting. First, thanks a lot for Ben and Tusher and other folks for all the very valuable input. So I have kind of had a summary of all the comments and suggestions we had, and put it under this topic for further discussion. Ben, I hope you don't mind if I put your name under the author list, because you have provided very valuable input for this proposal.
Oh, you gave me some credit, damn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can go ahead under this summary of the further discussion topics. If we can, for other folks, if you haven't take a look at this proposal, a quick summary is we're trying to bring in the failure domain support for the control plane node for CAPV. The failure domain for control plane KCP already added for other public cloud like Amazon and Azure, but for CAPV there is specific challenges, because we need to provide all the user-defined topology together with all the placement constraint into CAPV. So CAPV need to know where to actually place the machines. The discussion that we had last week, I think during the full 2 weeks, I think it's mainly focused on a couple of items. First of all, the Ben have a very great idea that we should clearly separate the failure domain and the placement constraint, and have a clear separation between those. And we haven't all agreed on this part. And the failure domains should be something the vSphere admin configure on the infrastructure, and that is something maybe CAPV should not touch. It will be some input into CAPV. Okay, this is the failure domain that is configured within the vSphere infrastructure, and you need to using this already configured information to place the VM. Then the placement constraint is something kind of a metadata we can add it onto the failure domain. For example, which data store, which resource pool that the CAPV should use to place the VM into. So those we have defined the glossary, and we have the clear separation between those. And in the following proposal, we try to maintain this clear separation between those different concepts. Then the couple of questions we haven't reached to the conclusion. The first one is it a hard requirement that the region and the zone that we are using for the failure domains must align with the CPI and the CSI? The question I'm asking is, for a couple of the use cases, for example, if we mapping a region to data center and a compute cluster to a zone, so that can align with the CPI and the CSI tagging the topology pretty well. So there's no issue for that use case. But there are folks that trying to achieve for covering for other use cases, for example, mapping a compute cluster to a region, but different host groups into a zone. With that use case, one of the challenges we think that we might have is there's no way to tag your host group. So that you can put tags on your compute cluster. You can put your tags on your each individual host machines, but there's no way to tag the host group. So if we want to kind of also support that use case, then the failure domain information kind of configuration might be different. So one proposal we were thinking is we can use the host group as a zone, then like vSphere admin can tag each individual host within that host group. And we can kind of summarize and create these kind of host groups dynamically. Through that way, we can also achieve the goal that the failure domain come from one single source. It comes from the tags. But at the same time, that brings other concerns. For example, then that means the cloud credential that CapV is currently using need to have the permission to configure your host groups that may not be available for all the different use cases that we want to cover. So this is the first first question. Yeah.
I mean, so I would say that my desire primarily is to have one way of doing things if we possibly can, and to try to exhaust all possible ways of achieving it with that one way before we start looking at more ways. And I want to just try to clarify my understanding of a couple of things, because I didn't fully understand the comment that Tushar posted. So what I'd like to see, as you mentioned, is to see everything plumbed through so that CSI and CPI, vSphere, and the nodes that come up that are deployed by CapV, which are going to be tagged with the region and zone, that all of that is consistent, that it's plumbed all the way through, that nothing's confused, and that everything kind of knows where it stands, right? Particularly DRS, because we really want DRS to be able to work with this as well, and make sure that, if it has to move hosts, it moves them to places that are appropriate with the region or zone that it's tagged with. So I may be showing my ignorance here. Is host group actually a vSphere construct? It sounds like it is. Is that because I haven't come across that?
It is. I think it is.
Okay. So how do you? Okay. So, but you can't tag a host group. It sounds like.
It is not like an inventory path. It's kind of a different concept. A different level of abstraction. It's not like the compute cluster. You have inventory paths. It's not like that.
So that's weird. So it doesn't show up in the inventory, but it's you do it. Okay, so Scott's helping me here. Scott, you could host group is in ESX. Oh, it's a folder that ESXi hosts live in. Okay, so it's like a convention that you can use to imply that hosts are grouped by just putting them in a folder. Is that am I reading that right?
Yes, it's the folders, just like the VM folders. You can also create host folders.
Okay.
Then showed in the hosting clusters view.
Okay. And so it makes sense that's why we can't tag it, because it's not actually an inventory item. Okay, that makes sense. So if you're right. If a vSphere admin were to group hosts in a folder, then they would have to tag those hosts in order to provide an explicit association rather than just the implied association. So June, can you tell me then why does CapV need to create a host group? Like what purpose does that serve?
The host group is mainly used for the VM to VM affinity rules that we want to achieve.
Okay.
For example, you create a host group and you create a VM group, and the VM group is tied to the host group. Then when we create the control plane node, we can spread the control plane node into different VM groups. Then the DRS will take that VM and put it into the host group.
Okay, so DRS understands host groups and knows how to deploy to host groups.
Yeah.
I see.
That's my
Okay.
opinion, yeah.
Okay. So I mean, this problem seems to be really the fact that we have this inability to tag a host group, because if we could tag a host group, it would solve everything.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we can tag hosts, let's say we accept the annoyance of having to manually tag hosts in a host group and provide that tagging mechanism. If we were to do that, and let's say that we have, like rack 1, and we tag a bunch of hosts with rack 1, would we still need to create the host group for CapV to be able to create the DRS rules, or would we still need a host group in order for DRS to understand that?
I believe so. We still need to create the host group for the DRS to understand.
Hey, that's ugly. Wow, that's really ugly. Okay.
So I would like to add something there. I think there are two ways. Prior to 7.0, there was no compute policy. And then after 7.0, there is a compute policy. So what you do is you tag some host, and then you tag some VMs, and you define a compute policy that these tags are fine. And that's how it works. But prior to 7.0, you can create a host group, you can create a VM group, and then create an anti-affinity or affinity must or should rule that puts all the VMs in that VM group onto all the hosts in one of the host groups. So how,
I see.
I mean, yeah, so there could be different ways. I think one part is easy configuration. I think it can come from outside. And the second part is assignment. So assignment part will be either to create a VM group and a rule and to associate with that host group, or it could be to attach relevant tags to VMs so that as per the compute policy defined, they just start to affine or anti-affine.
So I mean, I guess we should call this out explicitly. One of the requirements here is that this works on vSphere 6.7, I would imagine, right? So we need to work with host groups and VM groups. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then
Okay.
I don't know, I mean, how much compute policy, I mean, was introduced in 6.7 U3, because that can be found out. I'm totally not sure, but I definitely know 7.0 has it.
Okay. My unease with the idea of having CapV be able to manipulate vSphere is that, like for a vSphere admin to be giving CapV, well, that's not true. Actually, let me step back on that. CapV is going to be creating VMs. So it's already manipulating vSphere, and it's already going to need vSphere credentials in order to be able to do that. So maybe for CapV to be able to create host groups is actually no big deal. I mean, is there a compelling reason to not allow it to do that?
Well,
it could be a one-time operation.
Sorry, go on, June.
Yeah, my understanding is CapV is already like creating VMs, like you mentioned.
Yes.
But,
yes, right.
Hosted group configuration is a kind of a different level of permission.
Right. Okay.
Feels like it's still a little bit different.
Well, then how about we say, is another approach to say that if you want to take advantage of the host group scenario, you need the vSphere admin needs to set up a host group ahead of time, and then pass the reference of the host group to the to CapV, which would mean then that host group would be an additional explicit fault domain that we provide, rather than being a placement constraint. I mean, does that work? Would people be happy with that?
Well, go ahead, Tushar.
Prakash here, can I?
Yeah, Prakash has raised his hand.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what I see here, anything that is internal to vSphere, why do we need to expose outside? Can't we do internally like we do for the pod affinity and kind of thing we do in Kubernetes to just the host, you can add labels to the host, that is the nodes.
Yes.
And why not just take the host group, what is there, and apply those additional tags without removing the other labels, add this label as extra label, so that what stays internal, and externally they don't know whether it is host group or not, but they can then deal with it.
That would be my preference, Prakash. But June was saying that he believes that when it comes to creating affinity rules for where the VMs get deployed, that's not enough, that we do need host groups as well. I don't fully understand that point, June, so maybe you can expand on why tags aren't sufficient to be able to create those affinity rules. Like, why can't I tag a bunch of hosts with rack 1 and then create affinity rules that say all these control plane VMs must be deployed into any host tagged with that rule?
I can dig in further, but based on the experimental that I have done so far, and also the documentation I've written so far, the affinity rules only applied to the host groups and the VM groups. It's not tied to a specific host.
I think we should get someone from the DRS team to double check that, because the reason I wanted to just dig in on that is because it really feels like an important point. If there were a way that we could make tags on hosts work with this, then it would solve all our problems and we would be able to move on. Because I take Prakash's point, like, my preference is always for loose coupling rather than tight coupling. Like, any time that we're exposing a specific knowledge of vSphere inventory items or vSphere organization, we inherently make the thing fragile, because the moment something changes, our configurations are broken. So if we can, tags give us this nice loose coupling from one to the other. So maybe we could take that as an offline thing to, I mean, I can reach out to some folks I know in the DRS team and just double check with them on that point. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Sure.
Great.
Can I add comments?
Yeah, sure, of course you can, Prakash.
So it's a VM to VM communication on different hosts. If that is the use case for the host groups, then it is not something to do with CSI. It has more to do with the storage, but more to do with the networking. So we have to look at networking as a means of communication, that how does it impact, rather than just the DRS. That's my thought. Maybe.
Yeah, I
we
mean,
have to dig into it.
I think you have to take all three things into consideration, right? You've got to have shared storage, you've got to have the networking, and you've got to have compute in the same place, right? And I guess a failure domain by definition should have all of those three things.
Scott?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I've talked with people before from the DRS team as well, that there is currently the only way, even in 7, if using DRS, is to use host groups, and there is currently no dynamic host group type mechanism, unfortunately. So because of that, the host groups would be necessary. The other option is to possibly, though, if you want to use the failure domains the user used for CAPV has to have the permission to create host groups. If you're not going to use failure domains, then it doesn't need that. But anyways, it's going to need permissions on DRS in order to create the VM groups to create this anyways. So with that being the case, I don't see the real difference between giving the ability to create a VM group or a host group. Because of host could be a part of multiple host groups. It's not like we limit then the ability of the user to actually, or the vSphere admin to actually change other configurations or run other workloads on that same cluster as he would see fit. If you want to use this, then you need a specific permission, like they would need for tagging VMs, which is also a completely different permission. That would be needed for failure domains and isn't currently needed.
Thanks. I can't raise hand, so I'll use my host rights. Here, we've got some similar issues in the AWS provider, right? So around lease permissions, you see it more in the AWS environment because there's a strong emphasis on very tight IAM lease permissions across the board. We're thinking of moving to a model where you've got to be absolutely explicit about everything. We're going to have separate CRDs for pretty much every construct. And in that way, users can then fine tune to permissions that they grant Cluster API AWS. And I think it's a similar case here. What I don't, if we are going to do anything around dynamically creating host groups, I don't think it should be something that's done implicitly as you create a vSphere cluster. It's got to be an external object that you can then reference in your cluster, and then that also allows VI admins to use Kubernetes RBAC to correctly sort of to limit who can do those types of operations.
I think that's a great observation, Nadir. And that actually ties in with a suggestion that I made on the document, that we actually have a CRD that actually defines, that binds the fault domain with any placement constraints that you have, and that be something defined out, as its own CRD, as something that you can configure and sort of use over. The nice thing about that being its own CRD is that we can apply distinct validation to it and display that validation in the status to say, oh yeah, this deployment zone that you've defined is valid or isn't valid, or you have permissions or you don't have permissions, or whatever we might want to put in the status. So the idea of having I really like that, actually, the idea of defining a host group as a CRD, which would itself be a fault domain, and to being able to, again, validate that and use specific permissions around being able to create and maintain that. I like that a lot. And we could, and the other reason I really like that is because it opens the door to paravirtualization, right? It opens the door to the vSphere admin creating a host group themselves, and then the host group CRD just popping up and appearing in the cluster. And that if we get to a point where we can do that, and the vSphere admins tasks, I mean, this is what we do in Pacific already, right? The things you do in vSphere just appear in the supervisor cluster. I think that would actually be great. So I'm a big thumbs up for that idea. Thank you, Nadir.
Cool. Tasha?
Yeah, I also like that idea. The only thing I want to ask is, like, who's going to reconcile those CRDs? Like there's a CRD for host group, so validate or create that kind of, is it like CAPV manager, or we'll have a separate controller like vSphere AZ configurator, or like fault domain configurator?
I'm not sure. It could be either, really. So right now in Cluster API AWS, everything's in one, well, all the EC2 bits are in one controller. We do have separate controllers for Elastic Kubernetes Service. There is another model that AWS is going down around their service operator, and they actually create different controllers for each of those services, so the account owners can sort of really decide what are people allowed to do on that Kubernetes cluster in terms of resource creation. Or we can enable this through feature flags as well. So we have a feature flag mechanism cluster API modeled on the Kubernetes feature flags to allow us to turn off and on certain things as well.
So Prakash here.
Yep.
Obviously,
Okay.
we are talking of a CRD, and obviously there is a control loop, and this is an extension of Kubernetes API for the host group. So therefore, there will be a separate control loop to manage it. As far as how does it interact with the vSphere control group, I have no idea. But I think the answer to what Agrawal asked is that how will the watch loop work? It will be a separate control loop based on the host group API extension. And so therefore, I think in part, I agree with Ben that this is the best way to go about. Because there is already proven mechanisms to apply that. It's just a question of, are the control loops mutually exclusive? Sure, they are mutually exclusive as far as controllers are concerned. You can have a controller of controllers manage those controllers. So I don't see any reason this is not deployable. But how does it deal with the DRS? That is something still we have to look at it.
Yeah, I think we're going to be going more and more down this path over time. Like the VM operator, for example, is a classic example of a controller that runs in the management cluster and knows how to interact with vSphere and knows how to deploy VMs into vSphere. And this, what we're talking about, what we're describing right now, something that actually knows how to interact with and manage some of the way in which vSphere assets are organized, just feels like a very natural extension of what we've already discussed. In fact, it might make sense to aggregate it with VM operator at some point. But regardless, I think this model where we disaggregate the sort of the vSphere topology from the CAPV configuration, and that where we're able to separately validate those CRDs that represent vSphere assets, I think is a nice model. I do have one question though, June. You mentioned VM groups. So we talked about host groups. Can you just talk briefly about VM groups and whether you think we might need that to be a similar construct?
But the VM groups, my understanding is the DRS affinity rules and anti-affinity rules applies on the VM groups. So what we plan to do is we have a VM group which is tied to a host group. That means all the VMs that you put into this group, right, should be deployed into the host within this host group. And then when we launch the control plane node, we just need to separate out our 3 control machines into different 3 VM groups, so that DRS can actually put into like spread out into different hosts.
Okay, so it sounds to it does make sense, but so it sounds to me like it doesn't make any sense for that to be something that we define ahead of time, because frankly we don't know which VMs are going to be part of the VM group ahead of time. So that's something that makes sense for CAPV to be able to do dynamically.
Well, one way it could be like predefined is, for example, we have a VM group which is tied to the host group. They could use the same name, for example.
Oh, I see. So you create a pre-existing VM group and then you just add VMs dynamically to that group when you deploy them.
No.
So in that respect, a VM group actually becomes a little bit like a placement constraint, right? I mean, it's actually very similar to our, yes, Tusha.
So I think, so I have done this before in Cloud Foundry in the CPI, the vSphere interface. So what we did was we got the host groups from the admin, and then we created the VM groups with host group plus cluster group name. And then this was lifecycle with the cluster. So let's say if there are 3 host groups, and then all 3 are being used as fault domains. So we'll have 3 VM groups of like name host group plus cluster name. And then all the VMs of the relevant VM group will be added to this, and we'll create a VM affinity and anti-affinity rule. So the VM group and the rules will be lifecycle with the cluster, but the host groups will stay on. So that's how it was.
Mm. That means the permission that we have is able to create like VM groups. We kind of treat the VM groups and the host different.
Should be able to create VM groups, and it should be able to create VM group, host group affinity rules, but the host group permissions are not needed for creation. And I think that's something which can be fine-tuned in VMware permission and privilege model. It can even be fine-tuned at data center cluster level. So yeah, so actually a very fine-tuned user can be created by VI admin, which will just restrict CAPV to what it does.
Yeah, it feels intuitive to me that CAPV would be able to create VM groups and create rules around the VM groups in a way that isn't intuitive around host groups, just because that seems to be a little bit off limits. So I mean, to me, it makes sense that CAPV should be able to do that.
So my thinking is like this, that since the trades affinity and anti-affinity rules are tied in this case, specific case, because we are only dealing with VM, it has to deal with VM. So the unit of scheduling is VM. So that is tolerations part of it. and the host, that is the logical host, in this case a node, we have to think of that as the trait part of it. So when the scheduler does a ranking, whatever page, not page, the VM ranking which it wants to allocate or place, then it should be able to connect the traits and the tolerations to deliver what it needs. So two are separate. Node affinity is one and the other is toleration. So the node part of it and VM part of it are the two key. How you group them together, where you group them together, that you have to tell the scheduler to identify and then deliver. I think that's my understanding.
Okay, thank you, Prakash. Can I just clarify? To me, that sounds like an implementation detail that you're talking about there, rather than an architectural concern. Am I right there, or are you raising an architectural point?
Yes, I think you're right.
Okay, good, thank you.
Scott.
Yeah, I think also the permissions for the VM groups is also a key thing for CAPV, possibly in the future, to be able to, whether it's with a machine deployment or KCP or anything of the sort, to be able to actually set up also anti-affinity rules in disregard of failure domains, but to have VMs not run on the same host, which is also in and of itself, being able to create that VM group allows us then to create anti-affinity rules for the VMs. So having that permission could be very beneficial also in other use cases within CAPV to offer different levels of high availability.
Makes sense.
Okay, June, do you want to move on to your next? Sorry, Nadir.
No,
I'm taking over the meeting. I apologize.
I was going to say the same thing. We move on.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page for this now. So the next topic is so Ben, you have suggested this like the vSphere deployment zone, right? That concept, and we combine each field domain with one placement constraint. And I think that model works well for like one CAPV to manage one Kubernetes cluster, because we don't think it makes sense for one single Kubernetes cluster. You want to have all the nodes to spread across like different resource groups. But from a different perspective, right now the CAPV model is one CAPV instance could manage multiple different Kubernetes clusters. And it is possible that though the different Kubernetes cluster could be not on like a one single cluster, but multiple different clusters, they might be required to run. So the single level to one fault domain might not be enough. We kind of still need some input on the vSphere cluster object level to specifically tell, okay, for this fault domain, for this cluster, I need to place into this placement constraint.
Just to be clear, June, would suggested that you can associate as many placement constraints as you want with a fault domain. Would that solve the problem that you're describing? I'm not 100% sure.
Well, that's another option. That means all the placement constraints need to be predefined.
Yes.
Right? From one CAPV, you need to predefine all the placement fault domains, and from the vSphere cluster level, you just need to a mapping. The mapping is not to a specific fault domain, but to another level of abstraction, right? This is the actual fault domain, and this is the placement constraint.
Maybe I should tell you how I understand it. You can tell me if where we're, because I'm not 100% understanding. So my thought was we have this CRD that's a binding between the concept of the fault domain and potentially multiple placement constraints. And then once we have that, we can specify the reference to the CRD when we deploy a cluster in CAPV. So a reference to the CRD will just be basically a string in the YAML when we deploy a CAPV cluster. Then within, because this is going to be V1 Alpha 4, so we can make changes in terms of being able to pass context with a region. I don't remember 100% remember all of the types in Cluster API, but basically, as it stands at the moment, you can pass a region, but you can't pass any context with the region. So if in V1 Alpha 4 we were able to pass some context with a region, then we can have the vMomi part of CAPV unpack that CRD and get all of the placement constraints out in addition to the fault domain. That's my understanding. So can you tell me, like in the context where we want multiple clusters, if we have multiple of these deployment zone CRDs, then one cluster another cluster can pick a different deployment zone CRD. Where is the disconnect there?
I think I understand your proposal. The only point that I'm thinking is from like the user's input perspective.
Mm-hmm.
For example, right now, if one user wants to create one cluster within fault domain 1 with placement constraint 1,
mm-hmm.
the input that run out to the vSphere cluster is not the resource pool and data store that user usually they are familiar with, right? The input will be, this is the specific CRD name.
Yes, yes.
That you want to use.
Yes, and we would deprecate the API where you explicitly specify resource pool and whatever else, because as far as I can tell, what we're doing would be an improvement to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I don't have objection to this.
Okay, because as it stands, my observation is that we're already mixing up fault domains with placement constraints in the way our API is designed. And I would prefer it if we're going to be explicit about separating those, which I think makes a lot of sense. Then let's commit to that.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think if we just like have all the agreement on the community, that this will be kind of a big change from API perspective, right? From it's quite different from the previous behavior. Yeah.
I mean, we can continue to support it if you're not using regions and zones for a period of releases, and then make it clear when eventually it will be deprecated.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you'll probably will need to add a section on this about upgrades, basically. So people who are upgrading from one version of CAPV to this new version, what do we do around adoption of V1 Alpha 3? What migration can we provide around that? I think that will be something we'll have to put a statement on at least.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all the two of the major questions that I want to bring up. Those are the following ones are just the implementation details. So I don't want to take much time in the community. Thanks a lot, guys. I think
I just want to say I'm really delighted with how we've come together on this, because I think it's a difficult problem, and I really feel like we're getting close to a well-defined solution. So thank you, June, for all the work that you've put into defining this. I'm going to set aside some time to continue to work with you to sort of help crisp it up, and then hopefully we'll have something that that we can formally review.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jin. The next one is from me. It's actually on behalf of Yassine. So I think we're going to start adding a roadmap for CAPV. So obviously what we do around failure domains is going to be an important part of it. There's also some other deprecations that are going to be made, mostly around right now CAPV directly deploy CSI and CPI, and that's going to be taken out in favor of using DRS or whatever Cluster API does around add-ons management. So please take a look. If you've got any major concerns, then leave a comment on that PR, I suppose. Yeah, the other important thing is the HA proxy is going away completely for V1 Alpha 4 as we standardize on the KubeVip approach. So yeah, just take a look. And that's it for the agenda. Does anyone have anything else they want to raise? Or we can call it a day? No? All right then. All right, see you in 2 weeks. Thanks
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.